The things I learned at the academy, you could translate to really any career. It was more just like how I learned to live life. And that was with like purpose and team, the importance of making an impact that is greater than myself, and knowing that success often doesn't rest on the merits of a single individual.
Welcome to Partner Path, a podcast that unpacks the venture capital and growth equity ecosystem from a junior perspective. Young entrepreneurs and investors have already had a massive impact on the industry, having started unicorns and launched billion-dollar funds. We discuss these success stories and more by sharing perspectives and advice from some of the industry's most prominent role models. This podcast expresses our views as of the date published and does not represent the views of and is not endorsed by any company for which we work.
Today, we would like to welcome Jacqueline Blackburn, a principal at Decisive Point in New York City. She is a former Naval Academy athlete who served as a platoon commander for 6 years after graduating in 2013. In 2020, she joined JP Morgan to help grow the venture banking group. Now she is a principal at Decisive Point, a technology-focused venture advisory and investment firm specializing in government, public safety, and defense. Welcome, Jacqueline.
Thanks so much for having me.
So to start, very impressive that you were a collegiate athlete, specifically a runner at the Naval Academy. Going from the beginning, when did you know that you wanted to attend a military institution?
I knew fairly young in life. Service has always been a large part of my life. I was really lucky enough to have a lot of incredible female role models, particularly someone from my hometown that actually went to the Naval Academy. When I visited during my recruiting trip, I was really impressed with all the women on the team. They were traveling the world, doing incredible experiences, and extremely smart and humble. Actually, one of my classmates went on to be the first female submariner and then is now an astronaut. Had some incredible role models to look up to. That was something I really wanted for myself as well. Being on the campus, it's really hard not to love Annapolis, and those all kind of went into my decision-making process in terms of going to the academy.
I agree. It's a beautiful campus, and having played on the field, I loved visiting. It would be great if you could touch on how being a female impacted your experience at the Naval Academy and then after when you were a platoon commander.
Just to touch a little bit on what I did after my time at the Naval Academy, I was selected for Explosive Ordnance Disposal Community, which in short is EOD. So it's a small community within the Navy Special Operations Command, and we're trained to respond to explosive threats, learn about the tactics and procedures of rendering safe these hazards, and then we respond to traditional unexploded ordnance items, IEDs, so improvised explosive devices, chemical, biological, and nuclear hazards. And then we were also the only military entity that could respond to underwater hazards. So I was one of the few females selected for this community. At the end of the day, you do live as a minority in the organization, but everyone learns and is trained in the same way. We learn to work with explosives. We learn how to identify threats. We learn the basics of situational awareness and all of that attention to detail in both the permissive and non-permissive environments. We got proficient in diving and jumping as other essentially methods of travel to these mission sites. And so you go through basic training just as your male counterparts would with 2 years of schooling, and then you have workup cycles that helps you advance your skill set and sharpen the tools that you learn for the job.
Thank you so much for your service. And I'd love to tap into, since you did serve for 6 years, how many times and where are you deployed to?
After basic training, I was assigned to Mobile Unit 6, and that was out of Virginia Beach. From there, I was responsible for an 8-man platoon. We went through a 12-month workup cycle, and then we deployed to the Middle East for 6 months. When I returned, I literally walked across the street to Mobile Unit 12, and at the time, I was the first woman stationed at that command. So I did another 12-month workup cycle, and then spent another 6 months out in Eastern Africa. And then with each of these deployments is a specific mission, and it's all based off of emerging threats in the environment within the area that you're deployed in. So during the deployments, we partner with host nation, allied nations, and then we augment with specialized teams to conduct operations. And the teams you join, you become like family. You spend a lot of time together. So I was responsible for the execution of our mission set on deployment, as well as the safety of my guys. I was responsible for maintaining accountability of our gear and critical equipment that we had, but then also reporting up to our chain of command during operations and execution of mission sets. At the end of the day, you're a team. We each made each other accountable. We each made each other stronger. We each made each other successful. In large part, I couldn't have done my job without my team chief. Every team has kind of this senior enlisted chief that is the subject matter expert that helps drive training and preparation for the junior members of the team. And they're really the rock of the team. And I was really fortunate to have two incredible chiefs that helped me in leading the team as a junior officer.
That's great. And I'm sure moving to New York was definitely a challenge, trying to figure out how to get that team and purpose that you had been so used to for the last 10 years. Fast forward, you found your way into venture capital. I mean, are there any core values that you learned in the academy and right out that really transferred to your career?
The things I learned at the academy, you could translate to really any career. It was more just like how I learned to live life. And that was with like purpose and team, the importance of making an impact that is greater than myself, and knowing that success often doesn't rest on the merits of a single individual, and that it takes an incredible amount of hard work and perseverance to really accomplish anything worth value or meaningful in your life. And then I think in terms of relationships with other people, other organizations, fundamental to those relationships are integrity and trust. It's really what makes a team, what makes a relationship unstoppable and unbreakable.
And based on your background, I mean, it does seem like Decisive Point really is the perfect fit for you, but there aren't too many funds focused primarily on defense. You see a lot of larger funds kind of branching off or dipping their toes in aerospace and defense, but this is primarily what you do. So when were you first introduced to the fund?
Taking a step back, post-transition from the military, I left the military, moved up to New York to pursue medicine initially. I was pretty narrowly focused in terms of what I wanted to do. And I thought really the only way to help people was by being in the operating room, saving their lives. And I think gaining perspective, I realized that there's a lot of ways to help people outside of just being a doctor. And some soul searching later, reaching out to the veteran community I had, talking to my friends and family, I ended up stumbling upon the venture capital ecosystem. And I loved how tech so quickly make this generational impact. But as we all know, it's really hard to break into the community. So I started big by working at a small boutique bank called JP Morgan. I found a team that was working in the space and building out this venture debt portfolio within the commercial bank. So the senior MDs that I worked for, Dave, Pamela, Andy, and Katie, they brought me into their team. They mentored me. They helped me build networks. They helped me understand the fundamentals of the ecosystem. Since I was in the Navy, I felt like I was on the team again, despite being part of such a large organization. With a large organization, you end up having a lot of touch points with founders and the venture community. I really just wanted to be closer to the problem sets, closer to the builders and problem solvers, which is why I sought after an investment role. In terms of how I got into the defense side of investing, I first met Tommy, who's our managing partner at Decisive Point, while I was at JP Morgan. And it was through kind of like the veteran community. Over time, we stayed in touch. I got to know the team. And as a prior military service member, their mission just naturally aligned with my background. And it really felt purposeful. Many times, I was in the Navy and it was frustrating when we couldn't get the right gear, had to improvise, or if the gear was outdated, because it just drove us to spend additional time either maintaining it, the gear, troubleshooting it, which ultimately took us away from our fight. When I got offered a position at Decisive Point, it was a very easy yes. At Decisive Point, we focus in deep tech innovations across defense, energy, and infrastructure, and we really help our companies grow, navigating the government by capturing public R&D funding, and it provides this additional source of non-dilutive capital. And through our work, we're able to really capitalize on the technologies and the capabilities and get them into the hands of the warfighter faster. And at the end of the day, this really helps bolster our national security by leveraging and fostering levels of deterrence to keep really our adversaries at bay. The firm has been investing in this space since about 2018.
I think that's a great transition into the investment strategy at Decisive Point. Maybe you could just provide some more color on what sectors you look at, including defense, as well as the kind of fund size, check size would be good.
We have a very unique model at Decisive Point, but we're first and foremost a venture capital firm. We participate in seed to Series A rounds. We write checks between $250 and $1 million. We invest in deep tech companies, both hardware systems and software, that touch upon national security, but more broadly, defense and energy and infrastructure. With every investment we make, we essentially bolt on a team with previous GS contracting experience, and they help us lead the effort in customer discovery process within the government. So we work with companies very early in the roadmap, starting with capturing R&D dollars and then all the way up to congressional appropriations, essentially anything left of lobbying. With every dollar we've invested out of our first fund, we've been able to return back to that company $13 of non-dilutive capital. And then in an advisory capacity, if companies aren't a fit or companies aren't fundraising, we work with them one-on-one, help them navigate government contracting, finding those sources of additional funding. And then lastly, we work with a number of accelerator programs. So we work with the National Security Innovation Network. That is an accelerator program that's funded by the Department of Defense. So we have 3 cohorts there and mission partners within the Pacific Fleet, the Air Force Research Lab, Information Directorate, Special Operations Command. We work with the Department of Energy's funded accelerator program called Cradle to Commerce, which is essentially partnering with 4 national labs, MIT's Engine and us, and we bring in how do we take lab technology and build companies out of that technology. And then we also are going to be launching a accelerated program with the state of Hawaii, and that'll be specifically focused on the state of Hawaii's ecosystem and building the ecosystem there, as well as being able to capture some of both the private and public funding there. In terms of the accelerator programs, we're really trying to get how do we shepherd these new emerging technologies and really demystify government contracting for them and humanize it for them so that it's more attainable.
And I'd love to touch on specifically hardware investing for a little bit because it's atypical to what most VCs are looking at, which is just SaaS businesses. It's a different business model and it requires CapEx spend. We'd love to hear a little bit more about how you view the difference in underwriting and diligencing a hardware-oriented company versus a software-oriented company.
We 100% invest in hardware. We also invest in a number of software companies. And I think within our portfolio, we have drone technology applications. We have robotics, tactical AI platforms, supply chain AI, some quantum space. But generally, when we're evaluating a company, we're both looking at the team and the vision. And then furthermore, we're thinking about how are we as investors beneficial to companies as their strategic partners. So if their customer, for instance, is the Department of Defense, in the same way that you're looking for product market fit in the commercial side, you also need the same in government. So we look at prototyping. So how is this technology going to be used and employed? Who's going to buy it? And then what vehicles or pathways will help them get the technology faster to the warfighter? So if you look at kind of this acquisition strategy and as like a kind of a spectrum, you start with innovation at the far left, and then you move along through pre-prototype, research and development. And once you hit this milestone and you start seeing money coming in, purchases coming in, you then need to really identify where the critical technologies are needed within the Department of Defense and where that technology most aligns in terms of implementation. And that can be both in software and hardware applications. So this is where what's commonly termed valley of death. This is where you would hit that critical moment. In order to overcome this, so quote unquote valley of death, you really need to understand what are the requirements and where are the tools and contract vehicles that you can get to take a technology to the acquisition side. So those are the things that we're kind of thinking about from a strategic level for applications that exist both on the hardware and the software side. That whole spectrum of approach in terms of acquisition strategy, I think can be applied to both the hardware and software side.
And is there a difference in return expectations? The reason I ask is because I think it's a lot more difficult to grow a business that has to invest in CapEx. It's easier to scale a SaaS business model, right? Because the incremental COGS or production is really just a hosting expense. Whereas when you're manufacturing something, there are goods that go into it. So it's a little bit more difficult to scale. I'm curious to hear if that impacts your return threshold at all.
I think it does to a certain extent, but I think in large part because the technology, at the end of the day, the end user is the government, that a lot of similar processes are going to exist and a lot of the same checks and balances are going to exist, whether it's a hardware company or a software company. So I think a lot of the same challenges in terms of overcoming unique ways to find entry points into the government are going to align whether you're a software business or a hardware business.
You already touched on some of the value add pieces, but given that you do focus exclusively on deep tech and defense, energy, and infrastructure, I mean, it really does allow you to probably differentiate from other VCs that cover these areas. But in addition, they cover SaaS offerings, and maybe some people do have the defense and military background like your team does, maybe some do not. What are tangible ways that your team differentiates themselves in the market to win deals?
Our team, our expertise, and our access. As a team, we have deep expertise in federal acquisitions. We work directly with companies to really capture that R&D funding, win contracts, navigate the government regulatory compliance, being experts in rapid acquisition authorities and being able to guide companies and advise them on appropriations, compliance, congressional member and committee engagement is critical for a lot of these emerging technologies. And then I think through the accelerator programs, we're able to build really great dynamic networks of both DoD stakeholders, industry experts, research laboratories that not only gives us access to hundreds of companies and founders from different centers of gravity, but also allow us to leverage those networks as we're engaging with the companies.
Taking a step back and looking at the overall VC investing landscape, there's definitely a bit of hesitation to invest in GovTech in general. I mean, long sales cycles, a lot of clunky technology and government workers not wanting to adopt this newer technology, even if they do need it. I mean, so do you see the taboo around selling to the government?
Yeah, selling to the government is a process and it can be really challenging. There's oftentimes lots of roadblocks. There's a ton of different checks and balances, which kind of prevent some emerging technology. You have this pull push momentum going on. And a lot of times things simply just don't move fast. You also have a lot of turnover. So most military members spend 2 to 3 years in a particular position, a particular set of orders. So it's important that companies are thinking about iterating fast, early, and often. But by working with teams like us here at Decisive Point, who are at the end of the day problem solvers, have experience in navigating different types of contract pathways, we can help accelerate the process.
Double clicking on the government, it would be great if you could ground the group on kind of the evolution of tech within aerospace and defense, and then this hardware meeting software and labor shortage problem that really hasn't been around since the beginning.
First and foremost, innovation happens during a time of need. Aerospace and defense industry has experienced kind of this transformational evolution. And I think it's been driven by the integration of both hardware and software that's ultimately lead to more efficient systems. For instance, 2 of our portfolio companies, Firestorm and Episty, Firestorm, which is a hardware company, Episty, which is a software company, a tactical AI solution, they're building an attritable drone swarming solution together. And so they're partnering both hardware meets software integration. Like you mentioned, experiencing the challenge of, the current labor shortage, which requires innovative solutions to address the increasing demand for skilled personnel.
When we chatted, you were saying how the war today is much more information-based than it's been in the past. So I'm just curious, how are military personnel using AI?
The military in general is looking to leverage AI to enhance their capabilities. So how are they doing that? There's different applications that AI is being used today. And I would say largely autonomous systems, target identification, logistics and supply chain management, cybersecurity, predictive maintenance, training and simulation. Still large part early days of AI, and I think more will evolve in the space. But as the technology matures, the military will want to leverage those capabilities in order to maintain levels of deterrence against our enemies today.
And historically, there hasn't been a lot of VC activity and VC funding in aerospace and defense. More recently, there are a couple of examples to point to. One of them more famously is Anduril, which Palmer Luckey started post-Oculus. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how important is it that there are now success stories in this space and there are examples of companies working with DoD?
It's incredibly important. Anduril has done a lot of things right. They really understand their customer, which is the military, the Department of Defense. So they really build to mission. They build to the specifications of what the government needs, what the Pentagon has appropriated. So they're able to really bundle products into suites and understand how the government procures things. So they understand the process. And they're unique because they are leading with software. They're leveraging AI, ML, computer vision to kind of power all of these products, which are helping really the military at the end of the day maintain their own level of awareness of what's going on in terms of the evolutions of AI, ML. They're looking at modern warfare today and how will we win the fight tomorrow. Examples like that are incredibly important to support in terms of technology.
And has the Department of Defense changed in any way to help with the process? Obviously, historically, it's been very difficult to win contracts, and as a result, you've seen less funding, but we need startups in this space. So Anduril is a great example, and obviously they paved the way on the startup side of things. I'm curious if you've seen any change from the DoD in terms of improving the process for these startups.
We've seen this evolution over the course of the last several years. There are innovation cells and units within the military that provide that conduit, that connective tissue between what we're seeing in the emerging technology space and what we're actually employing and procuring today. Those units are really trying to connect both groups together in that way to get technology to transition faster. Within each community, the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, there's programs out there that help to kind of filter those technologies through.
And I'm curious to hear how you think the speed of advanced manufacturing, more specifically within weapons, 3D printing, obviously there's a lot of manufacturing that has to be done. How has that evolved over time in your view?
America's ability to produce weapons and munitions quickly, cheaply, and in mass quantities is critical to our own national security and our own levels of deterrence. I think we need to create battlefield change at a tactical mass. So we have companies like Firestorm and Batten that are positioning themselves in that solution, and it's part of this whole paradigm shift. We've seen companies like SpaceX be able to bring down the cost of rocket launch by a factor of 10 in just a decade. Additive manufacturing is a key enabler of this effort. Some of the advantages to kind of this paradigm shift is that when you have something that's completely modular, open architecture, you can quickly adapt it to new missions and roles. And then also scalability, looking at with simplified manufacturing procedures and cost advantages, it can be a real shift. The war in Ukraine really confirmed that America's industrial base is atrophied and following the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it's important to think about how we're building and making things today. It's going to be much different than what we've done in the past.
Speaking of building, some countries have really strict regulations around manufacturing weapons, and some are still developing rules. So what are the security risks around advanced manufacturing?
From a security measure, you have to make sure that you're following the guardrails and the requirements and meeting the compliance regulation within the Department of Defense. Those aren't always easy things to do as a company, but when you're engaging with the right partners, they're going to help lead you in building something that is compliant and does meet the security measures you're looking for.
And are there any ethical implications of using advanced manufacturing to create weapons?
At the end of the day, we have to maintain levels of deterrence. And I think part of being in the military, having my own background, having a weapon is a critical part of being a warfighter. There are ethical decisions that one makes as a warfighter, but you need to be able to equip them with the right tools so that they are empowered to make those ethical decisions at the time of need.
And you mentioned Russia. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about how geopolitical events have impacted the opportunity and relevance for these types of startups. Obviously, there's stuff going on with Russia, Ukraine, but also touching on the US-China relations.
It really just reaffirmed our mission and its importance. And I think we need to care about how we build today for both our commercial and defense use cases, making sure that we're staying competent, relevant, proactive in us as a nation from like a national security standpoint is crucial. That just goes back to the one mission, one fight, one team. We have to kind of all be in it together, and we have to be able to build things on our own and have our own capabilities.
Prior to COVID, there was a general globalization assumption that people had just taken for granted a little bit. And as a result of COVID and supply chain issues, and now with the Russia conflict and the spike in energy costs and loss of certain energy production there, people have kind of realized the globalization levels that we kind of assumed existed isn't necessarily a safe assumption. With that in mind, I'm curious to hear, how important is globalization in general to your firm's strategy?
In terms of like what we see today, the more that we can focus getting our key resources here in the United States is critical. But I also think making sure that we're also aware of what's going on from a geopolitical sense is also important. So making sure that we're having good relationships with our allies, being able to leverage some of their capabilities is also really important, right? Because at the end of the day, we're one country and collaboration of several other countries that we find strategically can be helpful to us. I don't know if you've listened to the podcast Acquired. Lockheed Martin talked about how when they were developing certain technologies, leveraging some of their allies' capabilities in order to advance their own systems. Having that allied partnership is also going to be equally important in terms of like globalization.
And today we covered a lot. It's a very dense industry, a lot of areas that are really ripe for innovation. If you could spend time in one area for the rest of 2023 to invest in, where would you spend time?
So we've been really focused on these modular systems. How do we make things cheaply, easily, and quickly? And then things that go out and don't come back, things that are expendable. For me, just given my background in explosive ordnance disposal, I've been spending a lot of time in underwater autonomous systems and understanding some of the gaps we have today, and then ways that we can use technology to kind of bridge those gaps and create capabilities. So that's where I am spending a lot of my time.
So to wrap, we have two questions for you. And the first is, what motivates you to work hard?
100% my team. I work with incredible teammates. I love the people I get to work with every day. That's what gets me up every day. And then I think also too, the mission, the impact I get to make, getting to touch base from time to time with some of the guys I deployed with. In large part, I left the Navy and I definitely thought about going back for a little bit of time when I first got out, realizing like I wasn't sure how I could make an impact. But I do think that even after my days in the military, you can still make an impact to the next generation of warfighter. And I believe I get to do that every day here at Decisive Point. So between the team and the mission, that's the most important part of my life.
That's great. And what's a piece of advice you'd give your younger self?
I think it's both my Naval Academy experience and my EOD experience, where I learned just to be a little bit more present in life, a little bit more less reactionary. A lot of times people, and I find this today now that I've like had all these experiences where like people get very antsy or anxious about a situation, when if you just took a step back, took like a deep breath and assess the situation, it's not as stressful or anxiety driven as one would think. Just being able to be like calm under pressure is a really important thing that I've learned over time. So just making sure that I'm always just taking a step back and thinking about the bigger picture is something that I have told my younger self to do more often from the get-go. But life's about the journey, not the end state. So
So meditation class at Decisive Point's office on Monday.
Sounds good. I love it. Yep, let's do it.
Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your unique story and perspective.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks so much for having me.